Hi, good morning. This is Steve Harton of the Harton Law Firm, and today we're going to be talking about separate rights of married persons, or their separate estates and their rights and limitations with respect to their spouse. So anyway, there's this concept, of course, that when you get married, you become as one unified person. That's why when married people buy property, real property, they often buy it as tenants by the entireties, which means that they own it as a single person. However, there are a couple of statutes that address this. There's one, Wyoming-2-1-201, that says that any property that is owned at the time of marriage or is acquired during the marriage by inheritance or something like that is the separate property of the person that owns that property. So in other words, let's say you get married but you already own a house and the house is in your name, and so long that house is your house, so long as you don't convey it into the name of you and your wife together. Or let's say you own a car, or let's say you own anything else. I guess, like, let's say you have a bank account that has or your savings bonds that you've been saving since you were a kid. Those things are your separate property, and they do not become your spouse's property just because you guys get married. On the other hand, if you're also, let's say you are married, you're married for 10, 15 years, and then you inherit money from your grandmother, that inheritance is your separate property and does not become marital property just because you're married. What you have to do is just kind of keep it separate, not commingle it, and we'll talk about that later. But basically, as long as you keep it as your separate property, it remains your separate property. And whatever separate property you have during the marriage, whether you had it before the marriage or acquired it during the marriage, cannot be controlled or interfered with or disposed of by your spouse. It also is not subject to division in a divorce, for instance. So, however, there is an exemption to that, and a caveat, if you will, that if you all expenses, the reasonably necessary expenses of the family and the costs of educating your children are chargeable against both parties. So if those things come up, they can actually go after your separate property in order to take care of your children. Well, that's kind of a technical little thing that rarely would come up in most people's lives. All right, and then there's something else that the next statute in the books on domestic relations says that a married person can transfer their separate property. They can incur debts, enter into contracts, and assume liabilities as if they were unmarried. So even though you're married, you can enter into contracts and get debt, pick up debts and things like that, and that is your separate obligation, and your spouse is not obliged to do that. So if you go out, for instance, during the marriage and get a credit card, they can't really go after your wife or your husband to enforce or collect on that credit card. And a married person can also sue separately or be sued separately, and then they can. So in other words, if let's say you're driving your car and you run into somebody, you can be sued for the damage that you caused, but that suit does not actually technically affect your spouse because you can be sued as an individual. And there's another little provision that says that if you have liabilities that you had before the marriage, and then you get married, and you also own land, then if the judgment creditor or a creditor gets a judgment against you, they can only enforce that judgment against those lands that you had prior. So if you acquired lands with your spouse, they can't go after those lands. They can only go after the lands that you had beforehand. At least that's the way I understand it. And then finally, the other thing that's important here is that any debts that a person has or liabilities that they have that they contracted for before their marriage remains their separate liability, unless that liability is assumed in writing by their spouse. So this is also important. So if you marry someone that has like debts like credit cards, student loans, and things like that, you're not liable for those debts, even if a creditor goes after your spouse, and also you're not liable for those debts even in case of a divorce. So anyway, those are a couple of exceptions that have been carved out by the Wyoming legislature to basically make the unity of a married couple not quite unified in all cases. If you have any questions about these kind of things or anything else with family law, please call my office at 307-382-5545. Thank you, and have a good day.